When our best fur friends leave our world, many of us are left wanting one last scritch, one last hug, one last walk together. One Last Network is a space for pet guardians to honor their pets in their senior years and to cope with the days leading up to and after their passing. Here's your host, Angela Schneider, founder of One Last Network and Big White Dog Photography in Spokane, Washington.
Hi, and welcome back to One Last Network. Thanks for listening. We hit 100 plays with our last episode when Darlene Woodward interviewed animal communicator and psychic Lori Blommer. I'm super stoked about that, and I hope you're sharing the episodes you love with your friends and family. Today, I'm speaking with Donna Wilson, who hails from my homeland in Canada. She's a professor in the Faculty of Nursing at University of Alberta in Edmonton. Her program of research focuses on health services and health policy, primarily in relation to aging and end-of-life care. She has conducted or been involved in studies on grief and bereavement, ageism, social isolation, and many more topics. This past summer, she and her team released the results of a study that found humor to be both a grief trigger and a coping mechanism for grief. The study popped up in my feed, and I was instantly intrigued. The link is in the show notes. Have a listen as Donna and I dig into more subjects than grief and humor, including what a good death is and why it's okay if all you do for a grieving friend is show up with a casserole. Good morning, Donna Wilson. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. Glad to talk to you.
I'm so excited to chat with you about your history and the research you're doing on grief and humor. Why don't we get started by having you tell us a little about yourself and how you attached yourself to this subject?
Oh, terrific. Well, thanks. I should probably say I grew up on a farm where we had a small number of pets, but we had a lot of animals, some of whom were ill and we tried to help them, but certainly there was death was a reality on a farm. and but I became a nurse and have been a nurse for a number of years, working in hospitals and nursing homes and other places. And you certainly do help a lot of dying people. You see death quite a lot, actually. In fact, I think nurses, are at the bedside of many, many deaths, whether it's now in the home or in hospital or nursing home. And you begin to realize, how the person who's passing away needs support and reassurance and some basic care, and sometimes pain medications, and, if they have a difficult death. But it's the people that are left behind that with the grief, the family caregivers that know what a huge gap this is going to be. This is their beloved mother, father, sister, child, or whatever. But then you also realize that there's some people that, they haven't had a good relationship, perhaps with their mom or their sister or whatever, but they have the opportunity at the deathbed to come and make up and say, yes, we had some differences, but I love you. And I've always really, cared for you, and, or I'm sorry we live so far apart that I didn't get to see you as much as I should have, but you're still family and I really care about you and I'm here for you. And, and this, so I got to see some wonderful kind of deathbed chats. And you start to kind of realize what an important time this is and how wonderful it is when you have some awareness that the end is coming. And as compared to, sudden deaths where you hear, my goodness, he had a heart attack and gone. Nobody, realized what was happening. So as my research career kind of took off, I was interested in older people. And most people now who pass away are older. And so then I got into, are we looking after older people well when they're on their deathbed or when they're dying, and where are they dying, and who's there, and what can we do to have good deaths, and what is a good death and what's a bad death? And then I started getting really interested in grief because I realized there were very few researchers doing anything about grief. That in fact there's anticipatory grief. This older person is getting ill and will perhaps pass away in the next year or month or week or whatever. But also then the grief that happens after the death, at the time of the death, and then afterwards. And so one of the very surprising studies that we did recently, I and a team of students and a few colleagues, was look at grief triggers, because you really have solid, heavy grief for a number of days after a meaningful death of a beloved person or even animal dies. Mm-hmm. But then after that, for even years ahead of time, you can have your grief triggered, and you can have very serious waves of grief or grief episodes when something reminds you of the person who is gone. And so that was one of the studies that ended up, sort of getting quite a bit of attention. And I'm glad that it has, because everybody expects that you're going to feel really sad for a few days if your mom or spouse or whatever dies. They don't realize that the grief actually goes on for a number of years. Mm-hmm. And there's certain periods or certain things, like an anniversary or their birthday, or something that reminds you of that person. You have a very major wave of grief that can last for a while. And
we don't necessarily ever get over grief, do we? Mm-hmm. We learn to live with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the sad thing is, though, most of the general public, they have not had a really serious grief episode. And so they sort of think, well, of course you're going to be sad for 3 days and then you'll be fine. Just go back to work, find a new husband, or, this awful,
get a new dog.
Awful advice.
Yeah.
Be feeling that way. I mean, it's been a whole year since he's been gone. Come on now, Mm-hmm. Don't get depressed. Go and see a doctor and get on sleeping pills and psych pills, because there's something wrong with you. We don't know a lot about grief again. So that's why I'm happy to be doing these series of studies on grief, to normalize it in many ways, and to learn what is normal and how do you help people who are grieving, and what can you expect when somebody is grieving. Because you're right, you can live with grief for the rest of your life.
Yeah, we've really taken grief and tucked it into a box as a society, haven't we? That's really at the core of why there isn't enough research done on it too. Am I right? Because we don't want to have to deal with it. It's an icky subject.
Yeah, because it brings up death and dying, things that are pretty scary for some people, and quite a large proportion of people. There's quite a bit of death anxiety out there. That's been fairly well studied. But yeah, it's an uncomfortable subject, grief, and it can be uncomfortable talking to someone who's grieving. Like, what do you say? There isn't sort of, 100 years ago, when death was much more common, where a man and a woman who married would expect to have, 8 children, and 3 may die. And their sisters and brothers would die with accidents and infections and war and what have you. People were a lot more in tune to grief and death and dying, because it was sort of inevitable. But then antibiotics came along and healthcare came along, and, we all think we're going to live to be 100. And, but really, we just don't even think about death and dying. It's not a reality for us. most of us who, we have parents who haven't passed away yet. So we really, and no sisters or brothers ever passed away. No friends have passed away. So we actually have very little experience now with death, dying, and grief. And so I guess it's understandable in a way why we are so uncomfortable being around grieving people, or and even knowing what to do when we are grieving ourselves. And that includes even when your beloved pet dies, or they're suffering, and you get euthanasia done. So we can grieve, not just for people, but for our beloved pets and horses. A lot of people have a wonderful horse, and when that horse dies, terrible grief. People really suffer from grief.
Detracting from your study about humor for a moment, you also did a study on older women and losing their companion animals, and the
Yes.
impact that has had on those women. What did you see? And how did those women in I believe there were 12 Albertan women in your study. How did they process the grief of their dog or their pets dying?
One of the sad parts of that study was finding out that most of them went home and in enormous loss. That pet isn't there in the house greeting them anymore and sitting on their lap and what have you. And they couldn't tell anyone about it because they felt that they wouldn't get comforted, and they would get bad advice, or oh, well, it was just a pet. It was just a cat. Go get another one. And they knew that that's the kind of reaction that they would get. And so they didn't talk to anybody. They didn't put out anything on social media because they didn't want to have to deal with calls or responses. Well, it's just a dog, or whatever. And they were very, very, very selective then who they would talk about in a few days. Like they might have a really good friend that they thought would be sympathetic, and they would phone that friend and say, I had to put Blackie down on Friday because her cancer was incurable, or she suddenly got really ill. The kidneys failed and she was suffering, and I had to put her down. So they grieved alone. That was the sad part. A lot of those older women, and they were older women living alone, except for this pet.
Mm-hmm.
And they really grieved alone. They grieved hard. They grieved long. And and it was a loss in many, many ways, because this was their companion, their daily companion that they interacted with and they cared for, and it cared for them too. And that was gone. And they were alone in the world because they couldn't talk about their grief because it was just a pet.
Yeah. And with my own mom, my dad died in 1996, and they had all of the kids were gone at this point, I believe. And they had a dog together, and that dog became my mother's, for lack of a better word, replacement husband.
Mm-hmm.
And when that dog died, she was devastated, and she never lost her attachment to that dog, just as she never lost her attachment to my father.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's, and that really is part of grief, I think, is coming to some kind of state at some point where you still love those people and those animals and everything, and being able to kind of live on, but still, many people never remarry. Many people never get another pet again, or they might get a different pet again, because it's such a strong bond, even after death. And whether that's healthy or not, I guess, it depends on the person. Some people can be very lonely living alone, and at some point getting a good friend you can do things with, even if you don't marry that person, or getting a replacement. And it's never a replacement, but a new animal, because I mean, we are social beings, and that's the pandemic taught us how damaging it was when we're locked away in our homes and you can't interact with people. During the pandemic, the things I missed the most was hugs. My family is huggy. We're very touchy people. And we just stopped hugging and touching and on top of the visiting. And boy, was that isolating. That was really, I started to realize how much I missed being around people and the hugs. We always greeted and, with a hug and said goodbye with a hug. And if someone was sad, we would hug and, things like that. And, we're social beings.
Mm-hmm.
And so our family, our friends, our companion animals are extremely important to our health and our well-being. Much more important than the job and other things that we spend so much time on.
To hell with work. I'm going to stay home and cuddle my dog all day. Can I get paid?
Yeah. Yeah, it pays the bills, but it doesn't always make you feel good.
No. And one of the women in your study was traveling, and the person who was watching her pet for her made the decision while she was traveling to put her pet down. How traumatic must that have been for that woman? She couldn't even make that decision herself. It was made for her.
Yeah. Along that line, how difficult that must have been. The worst deaths for humans, if a spouse dies or whatever, are the sudden unexpected deaths, where you don't get an opportunity to say goodbye, tell them you love them, give them that last hug, be at the bedside, make sure that they're comfortable, the pillow is okay, and they're not too hot or not too cold or whatever. And the same thing goes for our pets, then our companion animals. So in that case, yes, that was a really, really tough death for her because she was away. And you can only guess then, you hope that the right decision was made. That in fact it was suffering and it was time, to put the animal to sleep. But still, you're not there to know that animal that loved you, that was bonded with you, that would be comforted as it's laying there in pain and as it's, getting an injection to stop its heart and stop its breathing. So that would be a horrific death. And it was for that individual. Just like when we, hear that a best friend had a heart attack, or a husband or mother or father, and we think, oh my, gee, I didn't talk to them for a week or two or a month, or I haven't visited mom, because I moved far away and I haven't seen her for 2 years. I've talked to her on the phone.
Yeah.
But my goodness, I didn't get an opportunity to be there and say those important things and catch up and and all the rest of it. Yeah. So sudden deaths are the hardest ones because we have no warning. We need. I'm starting to realize, looking historically at death and dying, how important the deathbed is. To be there, death is coming, and you have an opportunity to say the things you need to say. And you have a responsibility to be there to make sure that the dying person is comforted, that they're dying a good death. So, there's a lot that we could talk about grief and how important it is, and how we need more research on it, but we just need to talk about it too. It touches us. It's very, very meaningful, losing someone we love.
I just recently learned that hearing is the last sense we lose before we die. And I hadn't seen my mom in 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Talked to her on the phone, of course, because she lived in Nova Scotia. And my brothers were with her because they live closer. And I had thought about having them hold the phone up to her head so I could say goodbye. She was unconscious for 2 days after they found her. But I was overcome by this feeling that, no, that's silly. She can't hear me. She's not going, nothing is going to happen. But now that I've learned hearing is the last sense you lose, I beg people to get the phone held up if they can.
What a good idea. And because you're right. I mean, families now tend to scatter all around the globe. And it's not, I mean, you don't schedule death. You don't say it's going to happen on Wednesday, so you've got 3 days to get here. It just doesn't work that way. And people have busy lives, and during the pandemic, it was difficult to catch a flight places. It still is.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be really hard to get back. But you're absolutely right. Having a phone conversation, a Zoom, whatever you can set up would be very good, because there's two important things happening. You need to feel good about yourself, that you were there in one way or another, even if it is with your thoughts, but you also want to know that they're okay and that they hear you or whatever. Not everybody wants to be there at the deathbed, though. I have fantastic grandmother who probably is why I studied aging and worked with older people most of my life. And she got to be very elderly, and then there was we know she's failing, it'll be sometime soon. And I went and visited her, and then then they said, she's really quite bad, you better come. And I knew as a nurse that she wouldn't live until the next morning. And I thought, do I want to be here? And I didn't want to be. I had a new baby. I just wanted to go home and I had said my goodbyes, and she was just resting comfortably, and her daughter and her had a special relationship, and I felt like I would be in their way. They wanted to be together at the end. And so I drove home to be, with my daughter, my little infant daughter. And I don't regret that, So part of it again is doing things that you're going to feel comfortable with, that you feel was okay or the best under the circumstances or whatever. And then of course you're concerned about them. Are they okay? So I think it's a wonderful idea talking to people on the phone. Absolutely. Zoom calls, why not? Zoom, why not? Because it is hard to get together. Yeah. We live so far apart now.
And now circling back to the study about humor.
Mm-hmm.
It feels to me sometimes when I'm doing these podcast interviews awkward to be laughing, because we're talking about such serious subject matter. But at the same time, we need humor as a healing tool as well, don't we? Because it isn't, you mentioned this in your study, that it isn't just a trigger for waves of grief to occur, but it can be a healing tool as well. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks. So just the background, we were doing this grief trigger study, what triggers grief and what do people do about it, whatever. And some of them said, well, my sister who died, she would just tell outrageous stories and we would just laugh and laugh and laugh. And now when I hear a story that I think, gee, I'd love to tell her, and then I remember, oh, she's gone, and I would get a wave of grief, or gee, that was just such a funny TV show, I would have loved to have talked with her about it, but it reminds me of her, and so you get a wave of grief. So grief humor could be a real grief trigger. But then we started to talk to people about, well, what do you do about your grief? And they said, well, I go and I find cartoons and I deliberately watch TV shows that are funny, and I watch movies that are really funny, and I visit funny friends, and because it makes me feel better, it gives me a break from my grief.
Hmm.
So I can actually rest. Like I'm feeling so sad and so lonely and whatever that it can just, I'm grieving so hard. It gives me even just a moment or 2 hours where I don't have to think about my grief. And that was wonderful for people. But the other, and some people said, hey, send me your jokes, tell me your jokes. I need jokes. I need, I need humor in my life. So, but the interesting thing as well, too, is grieving people used humor sometimes to tell everybody, I'm okay.
Yeah.
I'm sending you a joke. And so don't worry about me. I'm surviving. I will survive this. And maybe I kind of want to help you a little bit too, because I know you're grieving as well. But I know you're worried about me, and I don't want you to worry about me. This is tough, but I'll get through it. I'll survive. So grief was these grief triggers. Humor was just one of those totally unexpected findings, and how common it was used. Most people used humor for themselves to make them feel better, and also to make other people around them feel better. But not everybody was the same way.
Right. It resonated with me because, at my mom's funeral in February,
Mm-hmm.
it was the first time in a couple of years that my three, oh, where did that come from? My three brothers and I were together because
Mm-hmm.
we live separately across
Mm-hmm.
North America. And we gravitate to telling stories and making
Mm-hmm.
each other laugh. And whether
Yes.
it was a distraction from the grief we were all enduring, or just the natural part of the McIsaacs being in the same room together
Mm-hmm.
again, it felt so good,
Yeah. Yeah.
to not be crying,
Yeah.
but at
Yes.
the same time, the laughter can last for 5 minutes, and then the tears can come again, and then the laughter comes
Certainly.
again.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can still have joy of being together with beloved family members that you don't see so often. The Irish have a custom, really, of having fun at funerals. You go to a funeral with your best jokes, and you're going to tell humorous stories about the person who died. Everybody come up and tell a story about, John who passed away. And they're all laughing, and, it's interesting, there's different cultural customs. But one of the interesting things looking at humor is every single country, every religious group, every group of people has always used some kind of humor. Humor is important to them. It's part of our DNA almost, and so why wouldn't humor be okay at a funeral and afterwards? I remember the one person said, hey, look, my husband only died a year ago. I don't want jokes. He told jokes, but I don't want jokes told around me. I don't want people to try and make me laugh or whatever. I'm doing the job of grieving. I'm not supposed to be happy. I'm supposed to be sad. So you do have to be careful about humor. Not every family goes for it. Not every person feels it's appropriate. But the vast majority of people appreciate humor, use humor, and it's very healing. It is really important. Yeah.
We are Irish Scottish.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're Atlantic Canadians, so it's
Oh
natural.
yeah.
And I did sit in the funeral home at my mother's wake and think, man, if some stranger walked in here, they wouldn't know they were at a wake. They'd think they were at a stand-up comedy show.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's normal. That's totally normal,
They're
especially for your family and that cultural group.
totally.
Totally. And that's wonderfully healing then. That's part of what you do at a funeral.
There,
And
there
you tell
are
jokes.
there are a lot of dichotomies when it comes to life. There is birth and there is death, and there is,
Mm-hmm.
joy and there is sadness, and
Mm-hmm.
there can which also means that laughter and tears can coexist as well, right?
Absolutely. Or they can follow on each other very quickly. And I mean, let's face it, sometimes you laugh until you cry.
Yes,
They do.
we cry at
They do.
weddings,
Yeah.
we laugh at funerals.
Mm-hmm.
It's a natural existence of life, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And how wonderful that we have those expressions and people can read those expressions. People around you can often read those expressions. It's just again we see so little death and dying and grief now that we've lost a lot of the customs and we kind of don't know what's the right thing to do and we're kind of awkward and so this is why if you're grieving, tell people if you want jokes, lead the way, make it possible for people to be, to make grief normal, to, hey, anybody have a good joke about, this person who's in the coffin, please come up and tell us.
Yeah.
Because he loved a good joke. Let's enjoy our time together and let's celebrate the life of that person. Let's celebrate what they were like
And
and the legacy.
that extends so naturally to our pets too, because they bring
Mm-hmm.
us so much joy.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get to do it for our entire lifetimes, but their entire lifetimes are so much about bringing us joy and
Mm-hmm.
happiness and comfort.
Definitely. They're bonded with us. We're their world. you know?
And
And
he is mine.
yes.
And my husband knows that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What's next in grief study for you, Donna?
Well, currently, I'm doing a study of family caregivers who are looking after very old family members who are starting to need help. And I'm studying anticipatory grief now.
Mm-hmm.
Because while you're helping your mom and dad or older spouse who never used to need any help, now they're starting to need a bit of help and then a bit more and a bit more and a bit more, the end is coming. And yet you're still actively involved and you're trying to lift their spirits and be normal around them, but you're grieving. You start grieving. You know the end is coming. And they know the end is coming as well, too. So I'm studying anticipatory grief now because it's, how do you live with knowing that, someone's 94 or 104, or 85 and they've got a really bad heart.
Mm-hmm.
How do you help somebody help and be normal around these beloved family members? But you're grieving. It's sort of like what they say, the horse on the dining room table. Sometimes they don't talk about it. It's there, but they don't talk about it.
Right.
And that's a lot of death, dying, and grief. We don't talk about it. We'll just kind of ignore it. And yet there's a horse on the dining room table. It's a big thing.
And I think one of the things you're exposing so well by doing these research studies is the lack of service that exists, the lack of support services that exist for people who are in the anticipatory and grieving stages of death, right?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. It's kind of like, well, they're not dead, so why are you grieving? But again, that's, again, because we have so little experience with death, dying, and grief now, because most people do live to be 85. And, so we don't have classmates who pass away, good friends who pass away, aunts, uncles, cousins, what have you, we have much smaller families. And I mean, we're typically quite healthy until old age. So we've had the luxury of not worrying about death and dying and grieving, but it means we're kind of novices at it, and there's not many services, and we struggle to say, oh, should I talk about that, or should I just ignore it? Will I hurt the person if I say something? Will I say the wrong thing? So we worry about how we can help people who are grieving, even anticipatory grieving, because you know that you know that 85-year-old or 95-year-old, they're not going to live another 10 years or even 1 year usually, or maybe even 1 month.
Are we standing on the edge of a sea change when it comes to grief and normalizing it in our society? Because I feel like there are a core group of us out there who are trying to get the word out and saying, we're normal. We're not, you don't need to walk on eggshells around us just because we're grieving. But we also need to be heard. We need to be supported and helped through these difficult stages.
I think the pandemic helped in some ways to really move us a bit forward in terms of normalizing grief and having grief services, and people being more comfortable with grief, because the pandemic really risked a lot of lives, and a lot of younger people did die. The 60-year-old that or the 80-year-old that you thought would be around for a number of years. So I think in some ways the pandemic has kind of pushed death, dying, and grief more into the public eye. I think the other thing as well too is we've got this huge baby boom group, the massive baby boom group, who many of them are just caring for their dying parents now, and they're getting awakened to death, dying, and grief, and the grandchildren as well too. And of course some baby boomers are already 75, and they're starting to kind of look ahead and doing wills, and maybe starting to talk to families. The reality is mom and dad are gone, I'm next. I'm the next generation, I'm it. And now it's my turn. But I also think there's starting to get to be some nice research groups and hospice groups and that are doing good work. And if I talk about Ireland in particular, grief is a big deal in Ireland. Their hospices all have grief support groups. They have memorial events where people come together, and let's let butterflies go once a year, to remember the people who passed. And so some countries are doing quite well because they've had some leaders who've really brought grief to the public eye and kept it there, and started to develop some nice services and supports and ways of being, so that you know what to do when somebody's grieving. And so I think we're getting there, but I don't see a sea change yet. I think we'll all just hope to live forever and never have to deal with grief.
In wrapping up, what is the one thing you would advise people who know people in the anticipatory grief and grieving stages to help them?
That's a wonderful question. Sometimes people don't really want to have a big conversation about, their feelings or, what's going to happen or whatever. But, they can use a casserole. They can use maybe a ride to go and visit mom in the hospital, because it's tough when you're tired and you're grieving to drive, or to the nursing home or whatever. Sometimes concrete support is the best possible thing, or somebody say, look, I know you're busy visiting your mom or dad in the nursing home, Um, can I come over and cut your grass? You
Mhm.
know, or can I bring some groceries in for you? If those are such wonderful ways of support and caring that you don't have to get into a big discussion about how are you feeling? And, because sometimes people, it's just not the right time to talk. But everybody appreciates what's behind an offer, a genuine offer to cut your grass or get your groceries in or to pick up the medications from the pharmacist or, is there some actual way that I can help?
Mhm.
And we appreciate that because the last thing we want to do, when we want to be visiting mom is to be busy cutting the grass and cleaning the toilets.
Yeah.
Let's be frank, we can get pretty busy with daily stuff that needs to get to be, done. And at work, I've done a little bit of work, grief at work and that too. Is this is where bosses and colleagues need to be able to say, hey, look, we'll cover you. If you need to take the day off, go. Don't
Mhm.
worry about it. Or if you want to go into the staff bathroom and have a little cry or something or other, go ahead. That's, just real concrete stuff that it is so helpful because the heart is behind it.
Yeah.
The person really cares about you and has some insight into how you're feeling. So that's maybe the last tip I would give.
And that's beautiful. It makes me remember that when we knew we were leaving for Nova Scotia, our friend stepped up and said, "Don't worry about Bella. We'll take care of her." And
Yes.
that was such a huge weight off my shoulders because I didn't have to worry about her
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
boarded or with somebody we didn't
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
such a relief.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Donna, I'm going to get you to stay on the line so we can say goodbye, but I want to thank you so much for this. It's been an amazing chat.
Lovely. Thank you.
It's okay to tell jokes at a funeral. I'm 95% confident a couple of my aunts were less than pleased that my mother's wake was punctuated with a stand up comedy show. But I'm also 95% confident my mother would have loved the show, led by my younger brother Jason. I mean, he is the baby, and he could do no wrong in her eyes. The paradox of laughing during grief is indeed interesting, and I hope this podcast episode has given you some insight into how humor can help lighten the load of grief a little as we make our way along this path. I sure as hell have needed some lighter moments this year. And for heaven's sake, if you have the opportunity to say goodbye, whether it's in person or on phone or via Zoom, say goodbye. It isn't silly. I know that now. I'm Angela Schneider, owner of Big White Dog Photography in Spokane, Washington, and your host at One Last Network, signing off to go get some Bella snuggles. Listen to One Last Network on whichever podcast platform you prefer. We're on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Music, and Amazon Music. Don't forget to hit follow or subscribe so you don't miss an episode. If you have a friend who might be interested in our content, make sure you share us with them. Thanks for listening.